Nathan Roberts looked at a 60-foot limestone cliff in 1822, and he told 1,200 Irish workers to cut a staircase through it. No dynamite, no machines, just black powder and iron chisels. What they built in 4 years is still standing today. This is the Lockport Flight of Five. 5 stone locks carved into the side of the Niagara Escarpment, lifting Erie Canal boats 60 feet from the lake to the plateau above. 3 million pounds of black powder were used to break through this rock. Workers earned 50 cents a day and a ration of whiskey every 2 hours. Hundreds of them died. What is left of the original locks is still there. You can walk the towpath today and stand on stone they cut by hand 200 years ago. This is how they did it. The Erie Canal was supposed to be impossible. 363 miles from Albany to Buffalo, connecting the Hudson River to Lake Erie, turning New York City into the commercial capital of a continent. Governor DeWitt Clinton staked his entire political career on the idea. His opponents called it Clinton's Ditch. They said it would bankrupt the state. They said the engineering did not exist. And for most of the route, they were wrong. The canal's middle section cut through soft glacial soil. Crews with shovels and wheelbarrows could move earth fast enough to stay on schedule. The segment from Utica to Syracuse opened ahead of time. Engineers like Benjamin Wright and James Geddes solved problem after problem with ingenuity and muscle. Locks at other locations handled modest changes in elevation, 8 feet here, 6 feet there. Small climbs, manageable with timber and fieldstone. But then the route reached western New York, and everything stopped. The Niagara Escarpment is a wall of rock that runs from New York to Wisconsin. It is the same geological shelf that creates Niagara Falls, the same bedrock that the falls have been grinding away for 12,000 years without much success. At Lockport, the escarpment rises 60.5 feet above the surrounding plain. The rock is called Lockportian dolostone. It is a type of dense, crystalline limestone so hard that modern geologists classify it among the most resistant bedrock in eastern North America. Iron chisels dulled against it within minutes. Hammers bounced off its surface. No American canal had ever climbed more than 8 feet at a single location. The Erie Canal had to climb 60. If you have ever stood at the base of a 5-story building and looked straight up, that is what the workers saw when they arrived. Except the building was made of solid rock, and their job was not to climb it. Their job was to carve through it. The Canal Commission knew about the escarpment problem from the beginning. It was the single greatest obstacle on the entire route. Every proposed solution had been rejected. Some engineers suggested inclined planes, hauling boats up the cliff on rails. Others proposed a tunnel bored through the rock. One plan called for an aqueduct that would carry the canal over the escarpment entirely, supported on massive stone pillars. None of them were practical. The inclined planes required steam engines that did not yet exist in portable form. The tunnel would have taken a decade. The aqueduct required more stone than had ever been quarried in North America. The commission was stuck. The entire canal project, 363 miles of it, hung on this single cliff face in western New York. If this is the kind of history you come here for, and you are not yet subscribed, now would be a good time. I cover stories like this every week, and the algorithm does not always show them to you unless you subscribe. Then, Nathan Roberts submitted his design. Roberts was not the most famous engineer on the canal project. He was born in New Jersey in 1776, the same year as the nation. He trained as a school teacher and taught himself mathematics and surveying in his 20s, working through textbooks by candlelight after his students went home. He had no formal engineering education, no apprenticeship with a European master. What he had was an obsessive precision with numbers and a willingness to solve problems that other men walked away from. He had already proven himself on the canal, working under Benjamin Wright on the middle section, where he supervised lock construction and mastered the hydraulics of moving water through stone chambers. But the Lockport problem was different. The middle section locks handled 6 or 8 feet of lift. Lockport needed 60. This was not about moving earth. This was about defeating stone. Roberts proposed a staircase. 5 locks, built directly into the face of the escarpment, each one lifting a boat 12 feet. 5 chambers stacked one above the other, climbing the cliff in steps. Water from the upper canal would flow down through the chambers by gravity, filling each one in sequence, raising the boat one level at a time. And because boats needed to travel in both directions, he designed 2 parallel flights, 10 chambers total, 5 going up on one side, 5 going down on the other. Boats ascending, while boats descended. No waiting, no bottleneck. Continuous traffic in both directions, all day, every day. The Canal Commission approved the design in the spring of 1822. Roberts had solved the problem on paper, but approval was the easy part. The design existed in ink and mathematics. The cliff existed in 60 feet of dolostone. The question that nobody could answer with certainty was how 1,200 men with hand tools were going to carve 10 chambers out of solid limestone, connect them to a 3-mile cut through the same rock, and do it all before the rest of the canal was finished. The workers began arriving in the spring of 1822, and they kept arriving through the summer and into the fall. Most of them were Irish immigrants, men who had crossed the Atlantic in the holds of timber ships, packed together in darkness for 6 or 8 weeks, arriving in New York or Philadelphia with nothing but the clothes they wore and whatever skill their hands had learned. They came from Cork and Kerry, from Galway and Donegal, from Tipperary and Wexford. They came because the canal paid 50 cents a day, which was more than they could earn digging ditches or hauling freight on the docks. And they came because the canal offered something else. Every 2 hours, each man received a ration of whiskey. The contractors considered it medicine. In the malarial swamps of the middle section, whiskey was believed to ward off fever. At Lockport, where the work was dry and the air was full of limestone dust, the whiskey was just fuel. It dulled the pain in their hands and kept them swinging the hammer when their arms wanted to stop. They built shanty camps along the canal route north of where the town would eventually stand. Canvas tents and rough-cut timber shacks, 15 men to a shelter, sleeping in shifts on straw pallets that were never dry. The camps had no sanitation, no medical care beyond a bottle of whiskey and a rag for a bandage, no record-keeping beyond the payroll ledger, where a man's name was written when he was hired and crossed off when he was dead or gone. A man named Patrick Hogan from County Cork arrived in 1822 with his brother. The records do not give the brother's first name. A man named James McCarthy was made foreman of one of the drilling teams on the south wall of the deep cut, probably because he could read, and because the other men respected his steadiness under pressure. A man named John Riley signed his name with an X on the work roster that same spring, which means he could not write, which means almost everything we know about him comes from what other men said. These are names I found in period records. There were 1,200 more at peak, and most of their names survive nowhere at all. The camps were organized by county of origin, which meant that men from Cork slept with men from Cork, and men from Galway slept with men from Galway, and the tensions between Irish counties that went back centuries crossed the ocean intact. Fights broke out regularly, fueled by whiskey and exhaustion and the grinding proximity of men who had nothing to lose. The contractors treated the fighting the same way they treated the injuries. If a man could work the next morning, the fight was forgotten. If he could not, he was replaced. There was always another ship arriving in New York, and there were always men on it who would work for 50 cents and a cup of whiskey. The foreman divided the workers into teams of 4 to 6 men. Each team was assigned a section of the cliff face or a stretch of the canal cut, and the method they used to break through 60 feet of dolostone was as simple as it was brutal. Two men stood facing the rock. One held an iron chisel against the stone, gripping it with both hands, his face inches from the point of impact. The other stood behind him and swung an 8-pound sledgehammer in a full overhead arc. Every time the hammer struck the chisel, the man holding it rotated the chisel a quarter turn. Strike, turn. Strike, turn. The rhythm had to be perfect. If the hammer missed the chisel head and struck the holder's hands, the bones shattered. If the holder flinched and turned the chisel too far, it jammed in the hole and had to be hammered out. The technique was called double jacking, and it was the only way to drill a hole in stone that hard. A good team could drill a hole 1 inch in diameter and about 18 inches deep in roughly an hour, sometimes longer if the dolostone was particularly dense or if the chisel dulled too quickly. That single hole would then be packed with black powder. A worker poured the powder in carefully, then tamped it down with a wooden rod, packing it tight enough to build pressure, but not so tight that the friction from tamping ignited the charge. A fuse was inserted. The fuse was a length of cord soaked in saltpeter, cut to a length that was supposed to give the men enough time to reach cover. The men cleared the area, the fuse was lit, and they waited. 1 hole, 1 blast. A few cubic feet of broken stone blown outward from the cliff face. Then they started again. Think about that for a moment. 3 million pounds of black powder were used at Lockport over the course of 4 years. Every grain of that powder went into a hole that 2 men drilled by hand, 1 strike at a time. The arithmetic is staggering. At 18 inches per hole and a few cubic feet of stone per blast, the total number of holes drilled at Lockport runs into the hundreds of thousands. Each one drilled the same way: chisel against stone, hammer against chisel, quarter turn between strikes. The work at Lockport was divided into 2 massive undertakings that happened simultaneously. The first was the deep cut, a 3-mile stretch of canal that had to be carved 25 to 30 feet deep through solid limestone, connecting the top of the escarpment to the lock chambers at the cliff face. The second was the construction of the lock chambers themselves, 10 massive stone boxes carved into the escarpment where the canal would descend to the lower level. The deep cut was the longer project, and in many ways the harder one. 3 miles of solid rock, cut to a depth that in some places exceeded 30 feet. The blasting went on every day, all day, from sunrise to sunset. The noise was constant. You could hear the detonations from miles away, a deep thudding concussion that rattled windows in settlements 5 miles distant. After each blast, workers climbed down into the cut with wheelbarrows and iron shovels and carried the broken stone out by hand. There were no cranes, no conveyor systems, no mechanical advantage of any kind. A man filled his wheelbarrow with rubble, pushed it up a wooden ramp to the surface, dumped it on the spoil pile, and went back down for more. The ramps were slippery with dust and gravel. The wheelbarrows weighed over 100 pounds when loaded. Men did this hundreds of times a day. In winter, the conditions changed but did not improve. The temperature in western New York drops well below 0, and the rock became so cold that bare hands would freeze to the iron chisel on contact. Workers wrapped their hands in rags, which made it harder to grip the tools, which made the work slower, which meant fewer blasts per day, which meant falling behind schedule. The ramps froze into sheets of ice. Men pushing loaded wheelbarrows up a frozen ramp sometimes lost their footing and slid backward, the wheelbarrow tipping, rubble cascading down on the workers below. Snow filled the cut overnight and had to be shoveled out before work could begin each morning. And through all of it, the drilling continued. Strike, turn. Strike, turn. In January, in July, in rain, in snow, in the blinding white dust of a limestone summer. The dust was relentless. Limestone dust hung in the air of the cut like fog that never lifted. It coated the men's skin until they looked like statues. It filled their lungs with every breath. It caked in their hair, their eyebrows, the creases of their hands. Workers who spent months in the deep cut developed a chronic cough that never went away. The cough would deepen over the years, turning wet, turning bloody. Nobody called it silicosis in 1823. They called it stone-cutter's consumption, and the men who had it understood perfectly well what it meant. But they had no other work and no other country to go back to, so they kept drilling. The days began at sunrise and ended at sunset, 12 hours in summer, fewer in winter, though work continued year-round when weather allowed. The rhythm of the day was measured in blasts. Drill for an hour, pack the hole, clear the area, light the fuse, wait for the explosion, inspect the result, clear the rubble, start again. Every 2 hours, the whiskey ration came around. A tin cup passed from man to man along the line. A brief rest, then back to the iron and the stone. The men who survived long enough developed calluses on their palms so thick that the skin cracked and bled in the winter cold, and they kept swinging through it because there was no one to replace them and no work stoppage for weather or injury. The most dangerous moment of every cycle was the blast itself. Black powder is not a high explosive. It does not detonate instantly like dynamite, which would not be invented for another 40 years. Black powder burns. It produces an expanding wave of hot gas that pushes the rock apart rather than shattering it. This made the blasts somewhat controllable. A skilled powderman could predict roughly how much stone a given charge would break, but it also made the blasts unpredictable in a different way. Fuses were hand-cut lengths of cord, and their burn rate was never perfectly consistent. A fuse that should have taken 30 seconds might burn in 10. A fuse that appeared to have gone out, that sat there cold and smoking for a full minute while men began to approach the hole, might still be smoldering inside the drill hole, inches from the powder charge. The premature blast was the thing every worker feared most. Not the dust, not the cold, not the 12-hour days or the bad food, or the canvas shelter that leaked in every rain. When a charge detonated before the men had cleared the area, the result was not an explosion you could run from. It was a wall of broken rock moving outward at the speed of a musket ball, followed by a rain of stone fragments falling from above. At the peak of construction, during the most intensive periods of blasting in 1823 and 24, 5 workers died every week. Some were killed by premature blasts. Some were crushed by rock slides in the deep cut, when overhanging ledges gave way without warning. Some were struck by falling stone while working at the base of the cliff. Some died of injuries days later in the shanty camps, with no doctor and no medicine beyond the whiskey. The boy water carriers, children as young as 10 who hauled wooden buckets of drinking water to the drilling teams, worked in the same blast zones as the men. The records do not say how many of them were killed. The records do not say much about children at all. James McCarthy ran his drilling team on the south wall of the deep cut through all of 1823 and into 1824. The period records describe him as a steady man, not given to drink beyond his ration, who kept his team moving through sections of rock that other foremen avoided. He was responsible for a stretch of the cut where the dolostone had a natural fracture line running diagonally through the wall, which made it prone to unpredictable splitting. A blast might break cleanly along the fracture, sending a sheet of stone peeling away from the wall like a page from a book. Or it might not. Whether McCarthy survived the entire project, the records do not say with certainty. His name appears on the payroll through the fall of 1824. After that, nothing. The worst single incident that the records describe in detail happened in October of 1823. A section of the south wall of the deep cut, roughly 40 feet long and 15 feet high, collapsed without warning. There had been no blast, no drilling. The wall simply separated from the bedrock behind it and fell forward into the cut. The cave-in buried at least 4 men under tons of broken dolostone. Workers from adjacent sections ran to the collapse and dug with their hands, pulling broken stone off the men underneath. John Riley was one of the men they pulled out alive. He had been working at the base of the wall when the rock above him gave way. According to one account, he was buried to his chest in rubble and could not feel his legs for 3 days after they freed him. The other men pulled from the collapse were badly injured. At least one died that night in the shanty camp. Riley went back to work the following week. There was no other option. There was no compensation for injury. A man either worked or he did not eat. But the day that is remembered most, the day that stopped the work entirely for a full morning, came in the spring of 1824. A drilling team was packing a blast hole near the bottom of the escarpment, at the point where the deep cut met the upper lock chambers. The charge detonated in their hands. The records differ on whether a spark from the iron tamping rod ignited the powder, or whether a smoldering remnant from a previous fuse set it off. The result was the same. 7 men were killed instantly. Patrick Hogan from County Cork was one of them. He had been at Lockport for 2 years. He was standing close enough to the blast that identification was difficult. His brother, the one whose first name the records do not give, survived. He was working 30 yards away on a different hole. The dead were carried to the woods north of the construction site and buried in unmarked graves. No church service was held because there was no Catholic church in Lockport. No headstones were placed because there was no one to pay for them. The work resumed after the midday meal. If you have stayed with this story this far, I want you to know that I do not take that for granted. If you are not yet subscribed, I would be grateful if you did. These are the stories that deserve to be remembered, and your subscription is how I keep telling them. The grief of Lockport is not dramatic. It is administrative. Men died, and their names were crossed off a payroll ledger with the same pen that recorded the price of a barrel of black powder. Their belongings, if they had any, were distributed among their tent mates. Their bunks were filled by the next man off the boat from New York. The Canal Commission's records note the deaths in the same flat language they used to note the delivery of a shipment of iron chisels or the cost of white oak timber. Human lives, recorded as line items in a construction budget. That is the part that stays with you, if you let it. But the work continued, and as the deep cut inched westward and the cliff face was carved back foot by foot, the lock chambers themselves began to take shape. Nathan Roberts was on site daily during the lock construction, and his presence changed the character of the work. The blasting was brutal labor that any strong man could do. The lock construction was precision engineering, and Roberts demanded perfection. Each chamber had to be 90 feet long and 15 feet wide, with walls rising 12 feet from the floor to the gate sill above. The walls were built from hand-cut limestone blocks, quarried from the very rock they were carving through. The stone that came out of the deep cut as rubble was sorted, and the best pieces were taken to the masons, who shaped each block with hammer and chisel until it was square on all 6 faces. The blocks were fitted together without mortar. Roberts insisted on dry-laid construction because mortar would crack and fail under the constant pressure of water and the freeze-thaw cycles of western New York winters. The fit had to be so tight that a knife blade could not be inserted between the blocks. If a wall leaked, the lock was useless. If a wall failed under water pressure, the cascade would flood every chamber below it. The precision required was extraordinary for any era. It is almost unbelievable for the 1820s. These were not rough frontier structures thrown together by unskilled labor. These were hydraulic machines, built from stone, designed to move thousands of gallons of water with enough control to raise and lower boats weighing several tons. The tolerances were measured in fractions of an inch, and they were achieved by men using hand tools, working by eye and by feel, checking their work with plumb lines made from string and lead weights. The lock gates were built from white oak, the hardest and most water-resistant timber available in the region. Each gate was a massive V-shaped door that swung on iron pintles set into sockets carved into the stone walls. When closed, the two leaves of the gate met at a point facing upstream, so that the pressure of the water pushed the gates tighter together rather than forcing them apart. The harder the water pushed, the tighter the seal became. It was an elegant solution to a problem that had vexed canal builders for centuries, and it worked so well that the same basic principle is still used in canal locks around the world today. Roberts designed the gates to be operated by a single worker. One man, pushing a long wooden beam called a balance beam, could open or close a gate weighing several thousand pounds, because the buoyancy of the water supported most of the weight. The valves that filled and emptied each chamber were also hand-operated, controlled by small wicket gates set into the main gates themselves. Open the upstream wickets, and water from the higher chamber poured through into the lower one, slowly raising the water level and lifting the boat. Close those wickets, open the downstream ones, and the water drained out, lowering the boat to the level of the next chamber below. Each filling cycle took approximately 10 minutes. A boat entering the lowest chamber would sit in still water, its crew watching the wooden gates ahead of them, listening to the sound of water rushing through the wickets above. Then the water would begin to rise, slowly at first, then faster, as the flow built through the valve openings. The boat lifted with it, rising 12 feet in 10 minutes, the stone walls climbing past the hull like the sides of a well descending around you. When the water in the chamber matched the level of the chamber above, the upper gates swung open, and the boat moved forward into the next lock. The process repeated, 5 times, 12 feet each time. From the bottom to the top, the entire transit took about an hour. An hour to climb 60 feet on a staircase of water and stone, built by men who never saw a machine. The entire system ran on gravity. No pumps, no engines, no steam power, no external energy of any kind. Just water flowing downhill, controlled by wooden gates and stone walls that 1,200 Irish immigrants built with hammers and chisels and their bare hands. By the summer of 1825, the locks were nearly complete. The deep cut was finished. The final connections between the lock chambers and the canal prism above and below the escarpment were being made. Workers who had spent 3.5 years living in shanty camps, drilling holes in limestone, dodging blasts, and burying their friends in unmarked graves, could see the end of the project for the first time. The town of Lockport, which had not existed when construction began, now had a population approaching 3,000. Hotels, taverns, general stores, a blacksmith shop, a lumber yard, and 2 churches had sprung up along the canal route. The workers who had carved the town out of nothing were not on the guest list for the grand opening. October 26, 1825. Governor DeWitt Clinton boarded a canal boat called the Seneca Chief in Buffalo and began the inaugural journey east along the completed Erie Canal. When the boat reached Lockport, it entered the Flight of 5 for the first time. The locks worked exactly as Nathan Roberts had designed them. The boat rose 12 feet in the first chamber as water poured through the wickets from the chamber above. Then 12 more feet in the second, then the third, the fourth, the fifth. 60.5 feet of lift from the level of Lake Erie to the top of the Niagara Escarpment in 5 steps. The crowd that gathered along the towpath cheered at each gate opening. Clinton stood on the deck and watched the stone walls rise around him, walls that 1,200 men had cut from living rock with iron chisels and 8-pound sledgehammers over the course of 4 years. The boat passed through Lockport and continued east toward Albany and then New York City, where Clinton performed the ceremony that became known as the Wedding of the Waters, pouring a barrel of Lake Erie water into the Atlantic Ocean. The Erie Canal was complete. The impossible had been done. The canal transformed American commerce almost overnight. Shipping costs between Buffalo and New York City dropped by 90%. A ton of flour that cost $100 to move by wagon could be shipped by canal boat for $10. Goods that had taken weeks to transport now moved in days. Farmers in Ohio and Indiana, who had no market for their grain, suddenly had access to the entire eastern seaboard. The population of Buffalo tripled in 5 years. Rochester, Syracuse, and Utica exploded from villages into cities. Immigrants who arrived in New York Harbor could now travel west by canal boat for a fraction of what the overland journey cost, and hundreds of thousands of them did. The Erie Canal did not just connect two bodies of water. It connected the American frontier to the American economy. It opened the Midwest to settlement. It made New York City the largest port in the Western Hemisphere within a decade. And the Flight of Five at Lockport, the one section of the canal that everyone had said could not be built, was the engineering marvel that proved the rest of the route could be completed. Without Lockport, there is no Erie Canal. Without the Erie Canal, the American West opens 20 years later, if it opens the same way at all. The locks operated continuously from 1825 onward. In 1842, the state of New York undertook a major enlargement of the entire canal, widening the channel and rebuilding the locks to accommodate larger boats. The original Flight of Five was rebuilt during this period. The chambers widened and deepened, though the basic design and much of the original stonework remained in place. The enlarged locks continued to operate for another 76 years, until 1918, when the New York State Barge Canal replaced the old Erie Canal with a modern route that used concrete locks and electric-powered gates. The old locks at Lockport were decommissioned and abandoned, but they were not torn down, and that is what makes Lockport different from almost every other construction site of its era. I have walked the towpath at Lockport. I have stood at the edge of the deep cut where the canal passes through solid rock, and I have looked up at the walls that 1,200 men carved by hand. The chisel marks are still there. 200 years of weather, and you can run your fingers over the grooves where iron met limestone. You can see where the drill holes were bored for the black powder charges, round holes an inch across, spaced 18 inches apart, climbing the wall in neat rows. Every one of those holes was drilled by 2 men, one holding the chisel, one swinging the hammer, quarter turn between strikes, for hours, for days, for years. The original lock walls are still visible along the canal corridor. The wooden gates are gone. They were replaced and replaced again over the decades until the locks were finally decommissioned and the last set of gates rotted away in the weather. But the stone remains. The hand-cut limestone blocks that Nathan Roberts specified, that unnamed masons shaped and fitted without mortar 2 centuries ago, are still holding their position. 200 winters of freezing and thawing, and the joints are still tight. That is not luck. That is craftsmanship so precise that modern engineers study it as an example of what hand-built construction can achieve. If you visit Lockport today, there is a walking trail along the old towpath. There are historical markers at intervals along the route. They tell you the dates and the dimensions. They tell you that the locks were designed by Nathan Roberts and built between 1822 and 1825. They tell you the total lift was 60.5 feet across 5 chambers. They mention the 3 million pounds of black powder. They note the opening date, October 26, 1825. What the markers do not tell you is where the dead are buried. North of the old canal corridor, in a stretch of scrubby woods that borders a residential neighborhood, there are graves. They are unmarked. No headstones, no fence, no monument, no sign. The men who were killed during construction, men like Patrick Hogan from County Cork, men whose names appear on a payroll one week and are crossed off the next, were buried in the earth they had spent years tearing open. Their graves were never consecrated by a priest, because there was no Catholic church in Lockport until 1828, 3 years after the canal opened. By then, the men were already in the ground, and nobody could say exactly where each one lay. Nobody stops to read the markers now. The tourists who visit Lockport come to see the canal boats and the lock demonstrations at the restored heritage site. They take photographs of the stone walls and the water. They buy postcards. They do not walk north into the woods. They do not know what is there. There is nothing to tell them. Nathan Roberts went on to design locks and aqueducts on other canal projects after Lockport was completed. He is remembered in engineering histories as one of the most capable hydraulic engineers of the early 19th century, a self-taught mathematician who solved the problem that formerly trained European engineers said could not be solved. He died in 1852 at the age of 76. His grave is marked with a proper headstone in a proper cemetery. DeWitt Clinton died in 1828, just 3 years after the canal opened. He lived long enough to see the Erie Canal transform the economy of New York State and vindicate everything he had staked his reputation on. He is buried in a marked grave in Brooklyn. Schools, counties, and cities are named after him. Patrick Hogan, James McCarthy, John Riley, and the hundreds of Irish workers who cut the Flight of Five from living rock left no letters that survive. They left no diaries. They left no photographs because photography would not become common for another 20 years. They left their names on a payroll ledger that records their wages to the penny and their deaths to the paragraph. And then they left nothing else at all, except the stone. If this story meant something to you, I would ask you to subscribe before you go. These are the men and the work that built this country, and as long as you keep showing up, I will keep telling their stories. I think about Lockport sometimes when I am driving on a highway or crossing a bridge, and everything is smooth and fast and easy, and I do not have to think about how any of it was built. I think about what it means to build something that outlasts you, not by decades, but by centuries. Those 1,200 men did not know that the locks would still be standing in 2025. They did not know that the chisel marks they left in the stone would survive longer than their own names. They were not thinking about legacy. They were thinking about the next hole, the next charge, the next whiskey ration, the next 50 cents. But here is what they left behind. 10 chambers of hand-cut stone, climbing 60 feet up a cliff that the rest of the world said could not be climbed. A canal that turned a nation's economy inside out. A town that did not exist before they arrived. And unmarked graves in the woods north of the towpath, where the men who built all of it are still waiting for someone to remember their names. The stone at Lockport does not care who cut it. It does not remember the names. It does not feel the chisel marks that are still visible after 200 years. But you can. If you go there, if you stand on that towpath and put your hand against the wall, you will feel the grooves where iron met limestone 2 centuries ago. Each groove is the record of a single strike, a single quarter turn, a single man holding a chisel while another man swung the hammer. That is what remains. Not the names, not the wages, not the whiskey rations, not the shanty camps or the payroll ledgers or the unmarked graves. Just the stone and the marks they left in it. And now you know who put them there.